I'm Jeremy Porteous. I'm the Chief Exec of the Housing Learning Improvement Network. Just by a short background to say that for many years we were the lead agency in the Department of Health for managing the Housing with Care and Extra Care Capital Grant Programme. So we worked very closely with planners in particular to help the procurement, the development and the construction of a number of housing with care issues. And as a result of that, have built up a very close relationship with a number of planning authorities, TCPA and others. So I'm delighted that we could be joined by Dan Slade from the TCPA and John Snedden, Managing Director of Tetlow King Planning. This is obviously an online event, and our happy hours are really a way that we've moved forward from our regional meetings and our events, which obviously pre-COVID were all face-to-face. We very quickly adapted to a digital way of working. The team have sort of really grasped that, and what's also been exciting over the last 4 or 5 weeks is that these happy hours have grown in sort of attendance, and also the feel around the happy hour has germinated really sort of offshoots around looking at different ways that the LIN can engage with its members, both regionally and nationally. So we look forward to sharing some of those ideas later with you as part of my summing up. But I just wanted to sort of touch on, today's event is very much around thinking about planning in relation to the health and well-being of our nation, but also thinking about specifically how we can respond to some of the issues out there as part of the current consultation on the planning white paper. And many of you will be familiar with the HAPPI design principles. Well, we work very closely with Lord Best and the APPG on those, and part of that process was to engage with one of Dan's colleagues, Julia, who was very instrumental in helping us to think about how do we design for a healthy lifestyle in later life in particular, and how does housing for ageing population through the HAPPI design principles also refer to how do we encourage local authorities and their partners to look at the best solutions, and how do we plan those both technically through the planning class, use orders and use of land, etc., but also in terms of strategically to have a better understanding what the market is. So this session really is to provide you with an update on where we're at, and I'm really excited that we're going to look at 2 particular issues. One with Dan, who's the project and policy manager at TCPA, around a really innovative way, I think, in terms of trying to galvanise legislation and use that to sort of develop a Healthy Homes Act. And the Housing LIN is really proud to have signed up to this, Dan. So thanks very much for inviting us to do that. And I'm delighted that you could join us this afternoon. And he'll be followed by John Snedden, as I said, the Managing Director of Tetlow King. Tetlow King have done a lot of work behind the scenes with planning authorities, but also with operators, both in the commercial and the affordable housing market, to develop some fantastic schemes up and down the country, some of them funded by the Department of Health, but also a lot with different investment partners as well. So again, John will give you a little bit of insight about, are we being able to deliver at scale, and also what are the challenges at the moment in terms of planning. So I would like to sort of draw my first element around. I hope everybody's got a drink. I hope you're all ready for the thirst for knowledge that Dan and John will give you. And the first round is over to you, Dan.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. So, yeah, it should work. Can you see the slides okay? Excellent. Okay. So, yeah, thanks for giving me this slot to speak. This is quite exciting, I suppose. This is one of the flagship campaigns that we have at the TCPA at the moment. It cuts across pretty much all our areas of work. It's aiming essentially for fundamental legal change, and we've developed a Healthy Homes Bill, which I'll speak about in a little bit more detail in a minute. We've been working on this for, I think, the best part of about 1.5 years. I've been at the TCPA for about 6 months, and the ideas have been kind of percolating and developing for a while in various forms. And it's over the last 6 months since I started, this is really geared up to the kind of the national scale campaign, which we're now pushing for. It's an end in itself. We're genuinely aiming for fundamental legal change to change primary legislation, but it's also a way of trying to raise awareness of these issues and get policymakers and others to think more about the relationship between our houses we live in, are neighbourhoods and health and well-being, and the links between them, to take them more seriously. So there's a few different sort of ways we're thinking about it. What I wanted to do today really is just to talk through the rationale for this, why it's needed, think about the actual structure, it works in quite a technical sense, and its ambitions. And then I really would appreciate your feedback on this, and to sort of try and get your support really to take this sort of further forwards, and to think about the next steps and how we're trying to work influence in Parliament to actually get this to happen. There's been some interesting events on that front recently. So just to begin, since the beginning of the campaign, we've had this, we've always questioned what's the best way to sort of get people sort of bought into this, to understand how serious the condition currently is, how low quality so much new development currently is, and how badly that's affecting people's health and well-being. And there are really two routes. One of them is to sort of think through in terms of the data, the kind of empirical research, recent scientific studies, which again are all in our case, on our side. So they can make quite a powerful argument for this kind of intervention. But the other side is the more sort of emotive side. It's a bit more visceral, it's a bit more people about lived experience, and we realise that's what really resonates. So when I'm talking about this with politicians, this is generally where I start. So I just show them this picture, which is an industrial estate somewhere in southwest London. It's about 10 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, actually. It's in Mitcham. And I ask the politicians just where the housing is in this picture. So where are the homes? And they always spot there's a kind of arc across the top near that railway. There's some near the road on the sort of top right-hand side. You can make out there's a bit of a housing development towards the far left-hand corner, but the one which they always miss is here, right in the centre of the industrial estate. This is a consequence, as you might have guessed, of permitted development rights. It's an office block which was converted into homes for temporary accommodation, supposedly, for people on the waiting list, asylum seekers, vulnerable individuals who are waiting to have more secure accommodation. This is clearly, from this picture, a 15-minute walk to the nearest social infrastructure of any form. Whether that's a GP's practice, a corner shop is out of reach for most of the people living here. You can see that there's quite heavy industry in this as well. It's almost immediately opposite a cement manufacturer's, a paint stripper's firm, and a car breaker's yard, as you can see from these closer up pictures. The individual homes are too small for children to develop properly and to be able to learn to walk. But perhaps even more troublingly, there's no access to green space of any sort with it like close to the development. And children have to play in this main road, which is immediately outside it, which is used by heavy goods vehicles. It's an unbelievable environment for people to like grow and develop, and for children to have to exist in. And this is really where the campaign started, around the concerns about permitted development rights, the kind of lack of regulation which exists in these developments, and the very obvious impact it is having on people's health and well-being. And this is backed up by the research. So the government's own commissioned research, developed by Ben Clifford and Alex Lord and others involved in that, found that of 639 office to residential conversions, such as the one we just mentioned, only 22% met nationally described space standards, 72% had only a single aspect window, and only 3.5% had access to private amenity space. These are things which on their own are quite shocking, but viewed in the context of COVID and what we know is important for health and well-being related to lockdown, it's even worse. It's interesting that since this has came out, and since there's been a series of important backbench rebellions in government, the government's made important concessions and kind of admitted to the fact that there needs to be higher standards of regulation in relation to PD, and brought about concessions on space standards and on access to natural light. But neither of those things are going to stop this profound issue of homes being built in the middle of industrial estates, or otherwise in completely unacceptable locations without access to public transport, green space, and the such like. So this issue, though, is not confined to PD. The majority of substandard housing still comes through the planning system proper. As research by the Place Alliance and Matthew Carmona has found, in a study of 142 developments, 1 in 5 should have been denied planning permission on the grounds of poor design quality. And again, these are going to stand for decades, perhaps more than 100 years, and affect the quality of life of everyone living in them. So it's a profound problem, and yet we know the evidence base is massive. I'm sure this is the kind of thing which the audiences of these talks are like well versed in. But the Marmont Review had this as a central theme. Public Health England have defined quite tightly what a good quality neighbourhood looks like and what its advantages are for health and well-being. For a very important meta review, actually, Shelter have done important work on this. BRE have worked out it costs something in the region of £1.4 billion a year to the NHS. That's low standard homes, poor quality homes. And actually that was a few years ago now, so the figure is likely higher. And as I mentioned, COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns have brought this really to bear on our lives, and including the policymakers involved in this. So in dealing with these issues, the question is often put to us, like, why do we tweaking perhaps the national planning policy framework, perhaps changing building regs? And I think the answer is that this dysfunction goes deep. It's a fundamental part of the way that we regulate the built environment, which is about harm reduction and not actively pursuing higher standards and health and well-being in the built environment. Also, responsibility for quality is fragmented between different systems with different goals which don't link up neatly, and they're very poorly joined up, and that needs to be improved to some more holistic system. There are also no legally enforceable minimum standards on key aspects of building and neighbourhood quality, which we know are fundamentally important for people's health and well-being. For example, access to natural light, until recently actually, or access to green space. We can't just put them into building regs and say, tighten building regs up because that's what really matters, because these things are not enforceable through building regs. So we need something a bit more foundational. And we don't think that is unachievable. I mean, it's been to an extent done before. The Parker Morris standards were revolutionary in the impact they had on so many lives when they existed. And the Homes for Heroes scheme again shows what happens when you get behind something like this and have a genuine drive for improving standards. So that was this mindset and a kind of rationale behind this. So now I really want to talk about the contents of the bill. We've developed this with legal advice as much as we could afford anyway. We developed the principles, which I'll talk about in a minute, with working groups of specialists in each of the areas. As it stands, this is what we're going to aim to bring into Parliament and get into law. It might change later when amendments and things like that happen, but for now, this is kind of where we're up to with it. This was actually launched, I think, about 3 weeks ago in a joint session with the all-party parliamentary group, which was mentioned earlier. But essentially, the structure of this bill is that there are 3.5, maybe 4 large bits. So there are 2 key duties. That's, as you can see there, clause 1, and then down at the bottom there's 9 as well. They come together to put new duties on the Secretary of State to provide affordable housing, because we know that. And then also it's a fundamental duty on the Secretary of State to pursue the health and well-being of individuals in relation to the built environment. So they're the overarching things. At the very centre of it are the principles, which I'll come on to in a minute. And then you've also got the Healthy Homes Commissioner, who is essentially the enforcement mechanism for delivering these changes and ensuring they're actually happening on the ground. But as a starting point, we've got part 1, which focuses on this duty on the Secretary of State. And we used slightly arcane language, which we can borrow from other bits of legislation. But really what this does is require the Secretary of State to make decisions on individuals in relation to the built environment. Crucially, this operates on 2 levels. So the level of individual homes, but also places and neighbourhoods as well. So both of those are fundamentally important. At the other end of the bill, sort of cementing that, this duty relates to the provision of genuinely affordable housing. So together it creates a new powerful requirement for the planning system and essentially provides a purpose for the planning system which isn't currently defined at this level in this level of legislation. This changes and re-articulates the entire regulatory framework. They all interlink to be more about the active pursuit of improvements rather than mitigating individual harms. This then provides the platform. That's the overarching framework. That's the platform for what is really at the core of the bill. So these are the Healthy Homes principles. There are 12 of them, and they concern what we think from our research and from working with these focus groups, define a healthy home. Like, what are the basic, in a sense, they are really basic things required for a home to support health and well-being. In a mindset where we try to create a series of principles which we felt the public will be outraged to realise don't currently exist in any kind of meaningful way in law. Things like access to green space, I think the public would assume that is required of all new developments, and actually it just isn't, not in the way that the policy frameworks currently work, and not their level of law or legal requirement anyway. So that was the starting point. The way that we see the principles working is not in themselves to define and quantify the minimum standards for new homes. So it's not to say that you have to be within this level of proximity to green standards should exist. It's then for the government to, through a planning white paper, define what those principles are, what they think they should be, and articulate how they work in relation, for example, to local policy, and also to outline how they would reconfigure national policy and national guidance across housing and planning and every other way in which the government regulates quality in the built environment, whether that's pieces of relatively arcane legislation relating to infrastructure, for example, and how they're going to be reworked to support the delivery of the healthy homes principles. So this is what I was saying about sort of structures and systems which are in place for delivering quality in the built environment, and draws them together consistently, breaks down those silos. You can imagine this like a giant process of a kind of trickle-down effect, where we reconfigure primary legislation to embed these basic principles. That then feeds down to the National Planning Policy Framework, planning guidance, building regs, and everything else. Planning reform proposals, or in the current system. But also, because this is in primary legislation, development has to, in the first instance, comply with those legally defined healthy homes principles. So it fundamentally changes the way that the system works, and yet in itself it's quite simple. The principles therefore mean that as a citizen, as an NGO, or as a council, you can contest development which you feel does not conform to the healthy homes principles, and there are 12 of them. So these are the principles as we've defined them. They, like I said, they're surprisingly simple, and they don't define exactly what we think the standards should be, but more that they should exist. So they cover basic needs like access to natural light, accessible, inclusive environments for the homes, prioritizing active transport and sustainable transport, minimum space requirements as well. They must be designed to build out crime. We also consider noise pollution, light pollution, thermal comfort, which is crucially important in so many ways. I mean, you can see that they cover a wide range of issues. Health and well-being are all fundamentally important to them, but we really use that as the kind of hook, the inarguable sort of thrust of these reforms. I mean, you could equally make the case that all of these things are important to things other than health and well-being themselves. So a lot of our support for this and the organisations we work with are specifically interested in, for example, air quality, or they're specifically interested in climate change. But this overall kind of framework helps to deliver those individual objectives themselves. So yeah, like I say, speaking especially with local councillors, I think they don't often realise that there isn't this kind of legal provision for these kinds of basic human needs in the system already. And then the Commissioner emerged really from our thinking around how we can make sure that these, on the ground, these changes are made and that they're enforced. And in a sense, this is a bit of a cop-out. We originally were thinking about whether we could develop some kind of structure, a bit like an ombudsman, to actually deal with complaints based on healthy homes principles. But really, this is more like the Children's Commissioner, which is the legal model we use to develop this particular element of it. And the way it works is that the Healthy Homes Commissioner, as you can see from the list there from A to H, has a series of responsibilities relating to advising the Secretary of State in the delivery of these principles, raising standards, and actually also establishing that reporting framework and means of enforcement, so we're kind of kicking the can down the road in a sense with that, but I think that requires quite a lot of in-depth thinking. But really, we wanted to raise standards, raise awareness of this, work with Parliament on this, and make sure there's that kind of scrutiny there, as well as developing that kind of the core work around the principles, what they mean, and the requirement on the Secretary of State to deliver those principles. I think we can really summarise the argument for this in sort of 5 ways, and you can see how this, I don't think, from our perspective anyway, and I'd love to hear genuine criticisms if there are, but I don't think there are many kind of ethical arguments against this. So in the first instance, there's a clear ethical argument for providing this at least basic minimum standards, however they're defined in the future by the government for all new homes, whether that's PDR, which wouldn't be abolished under this move, but would require minimum standards, or whether it's through the planning system proper. There's a regulatory argument, which is really about clarity and consistency. We have this current phenomenon where so often there's this kind of crevice between the planning regime and the housing regime, where decisions fall between them awkwardly. When you're trying to secure consent, it can be a bit of a nightmare. Having clearly decided principles would create a much clearer framework for that sequencing and make simplify the process. It also would mean that the kind of baseline which is used for standards in different local authorities begins at the same level, which I think provides clarity as well. There's a kind of governance argument, which is really saying, once you have a principle, for example, that you cannot build a new home if the residents will be subjected to unacceptable levels of air pollution, internal or external, you then have to deal with issues around where that air pollution is coming from. And that creates what is actually quite a complex but useful chain of thought, which breaks down silos in central government. So it requires thinking and implementation happening between, for example, the Department for Transport and MHCLG in the delivery of these principles. It's kind of a second order benefit really into bringing around legislation like this. So in one sense, it's a challenge and one of the things we'll have to grapple with implementation. In another sense, it's one of the benefits of the legislation. There's also the quite simple argument about how much poor quality housing costs us in terms of health, cost to the NHS, local public health teams, and the kind of all that work which goes into that, and how dealing with this up front will just mean we don't have to deal with these problems in the future, especially when it comes to retrofitting. One of our big areas of support for this bill is particularly around accessibility, as you'll see in my final slide. And then the political argument for this is really the sheer level of alarming concern which is being raised at the moment in relation to the government's planning reform proposals, particularly on what the government's going to do to ensure that with its new design codes, local or national, this minimum standard is always there. And we think this is part of the solution to that. So I think that's quite a strong claim for it. So I've mentioned the bill. We think it's kind of robust. I have to say it's far from perfect. We're a small charity. We've poured everything we can into this, but it's still going to require more development. And we're quite happy. We're not picky when it comes to ownership. We're quite happy to share ownership with other organisations. It's an end in itself to an extent, but we're also realistic that it's going to be an uphill battle to get this into law. So this is also a means of raising awareness about these issues and to show really that there are solutions if we want to bring them about. It's doable. If we can produce this kind of thing, then someone with more resources can surely produce something even more effective. So, and on that subject, we think there are two possible routes into law. So I mentioned already actually putting this free in itself as some kind of bill. That would require a private members bill. We've got clear starting point for doing that in the House of Lords, but we want to aim to do that in the Commons. So that will happen probably sometime around January. And then perhaps the more realistic route is through amendments to legislation the government is going to bring forward, which are relevant. So a lot of you will be aware of the Building Safety Bill, which does important things in response to the Grenfell tragedy and the general need for improved sort of safety, but in many ways is a kind of just a mixture of individual measures which don't make any fundamental change to the way we think about safety and health in the built environment. When actually what we want to do is use this bill to amend that to provide the overarching structure to say we're shifting from a model based on harm and risk minimization to one which is about active promotion of health and well-being. And then with that parliamentary support, we're seeing growing support. I think we've got a list of sort of 20 to 30 parliamentarians who are interested in this and support it. Our campaign actually in the House of Lords and in Parliament in general is being led by Lord Nigel Crisp, who's a previous chief exec of the NHS, and Baroness Usta Prasha, who's chair of the Nationwide Foundation, who are our funders for this work as well. So it's growing, the momentum is building. And with that momentum, we're shortly going to be running a couple of events, one which you're all invited to, and if you let me know from some format after this is finished, if you're interested, we can put you on the list. But we're really running a What Next session where we look at the evidence produced by these academics like Professor Matthew Carmona, Dr. Ben Clifford, Dr. Nancy Holman, and they focus on what the evidence is that we're being harmed by the built environment as it is, the kind of regulatory systems we've got and how they need to change, and looks at the changes which have happened in Parliament recently and the government U-turns to say, where do we go from here with the Healthy Homes Bill campaign? And we've also got forthcoming work as well, which is going to expand the evidence base, but also increasingly make the case for this bill. One is that we want to produce a bill for Wales, which will be an adapted version. They're dealing with different issues in Wales as they are in England. But there's still a need for this kind of legislation. And that is also an end in itself, but also a way of increasing pressure on Westminster. And we're also going to produce two reports focusing on younger people and older people's housing preferences separately in two separate reports, and how something like this Healthy Homes will help achieve that. And part of that is really about addressing these arguments that younger people are happy to live in shoeboxes, and that they don't need these fundamental needs are different to most human beings, I guess. And if anyone's interested in that, I'd love to hear. We'll also expand our local campaign for this, and encouraging local authorities to adopt these principles voluntarily and put a motion through saying that they support this bill, which I think again is an important outcome in itself, but also another way of putting pressure on the Westminster to make these changes. So we've made good progress. We're kind of victims of our own success for this to an extent, in that we're really at the limits of our resources. So we'd love your feedback on this. I'd love to deal with any questions. And if you had any ideas for this, or including negative feedback on what we might need to change to make something like this successful, I'd really appreciate your views. And yeah, I'm not sure what the time is, but that's the presentation. Thanks a lot.
And well done, that was great, and very thought-provoking, and we've posted a few things that you've referred to, reports by Matthew Carmona for the Place Alliance in the chat box, Nigel Crisp, who actually I worked for at the Department of Health for a bit, his recent book as well, so it's great that he's one of your champions, and we'll come back to some questions. I'm sure I can see already in the chat box there are quite a few comments and things coming through, but I think if it's okay with you, we'll move on to John, and then we'll wrap up as part of the overarching Q&A. So please do, people who are with us, please do comment and continue to raise your questions. And I'm going to pass over to John. And this is very much around thinking much more about the here and now in terms of where we are planning for the future and the current consultation that's out there. So over to you, John.
Thank you to everyone, and thanks for allowing me to speak. Again, I know you've probably seen a lot of things about planning for the future and the white paper, but I didn't want to just give you a recap on that. I wanted to concentrate on specialist housing. And I think the background is, of course, we're not building enough houses, and we never have been building enough houses for a decade. The government's looking at 300,000 houses a year, roughly, as a target. And we got to 270, I think, this year, if I recall, but we've been as low as 120, 130. When you start adding that backlog up of failure to meet the target, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of houses. And of course, specialist housing, which I'm most interested in, is the thing that starts to be impacted by that as well as other types of houses, affordable and all sorts. And again, when we say specialist housing, there is a definition in government guidance and policy. It's all types of housing for older people. It's extra care, it's care homes, it's market housing just with an age restriction, and all different types of accommodation, really for the old. But I'm most interested in supported housing with care and care homes. So the white paper, again, the fact that it's a white paper is a big thing. I mean, it's a big thing. Planning is getting a white paper. We've had a few in the past, but we're getting a big thing. And again, the white paper is proposing changes to primary legislation, and we're going to be looking at changes. And there's all these different proposals which are going to change the system. And there's all sorts of proposals in there about essentially a development tax, about affordable housing, about first homes. What there isn't in there, though, is anything about the mix of housing. So if I look at the foreword by our estimable Prime Minister, he mentions, and I'll quote, "Thanks to our planning system, we have nowhere near enough homes in the right places." So that's nice, thanks to the planning system. We didn't invent it, we just have to work with it, but thanks to us. And then he goes on, "The whole thing is beginning to crumble as time has come to do what not too many have too long lacked the courage to do, which is tear it down and start again." So we have this white paper with all sorts of changes proposed to affordable housing, getting rid of 106 agreements, and I'll come back to one of the main pillars if we go to the next slide. I did want to mention the white papers are rather boring looking PDF, which you need a PhD to understand all of it. which is a bit bizarre in a scheme that's going to make planning more democratic and give local communities a greater say in what can and cannot happen, where many people think, you know, it's going to destroy neighbourhood plans potentially or weaken them. But the white paper is going to take up about a year is the estimate. There's various estimates, a year to get this primary legislation. And the government's obviously got a lot on its mind this year and next year, Brexit, COVID continuing. So I think the estimates I found is about a year to get the legislation in place, and then several more years. So the white paper should be seen as a big concept. There's not a lot of detail, there's not a lot of information, there's a huge amount more to come out. And I'm not cynical about it, because I think I'm all for change. It needs radical reform. In my view, it isn't radical enough. And what we don't have here is we don't have enough in this document about the mix and building the right types of houses. You know, we had a consultation a few years ago called right homes in the right places, or a certain combination of those words, and that was 2017. Some of that made it into the NPPF, the National Planning Advice, and the Planning Practice Guidance, the PPG. Some of it didn't, and that did concentrate quite a bit on the mix. But now we don't seem to have really moved forward in this document. Now, critics would say, well, that's not what this document's for. This document is not for increasing the supply of particular types within that 300,000 or 300 more thousand. And if we look at the figures, you've all seen the figures about the undersupply of specialist housing. I think the figures vary from a shortfall now of 500,000 houses of specialist housing for older people. The majority of the specialist housing we have is sheltered housing, about 50% of it, about the just over 750,000 houses that we have that are specialist. So the new white paper is trying to address this situation whereby we are not delivering houses. The planning system's too complicated, too expensive, takes too long, and anything that speeds up the system and makes it give more certainty, developers and operators, really all they're after in the main is higher degree of certainty as they can get. And they're really not getting that from the system now. What they're getting from the system is delay, high costs as time goes on. So it is disappointing to myself, who spends so much time promoting specialist housing, care homes and extra care, that there's not more in there. And it's not even really one of the questions. It's not even one of the pillars that's in there. And pillar one, planning for development. And again, I accept criticism that the white paper is talking about increasing all houses, and an increase in specialist housing will just be an after effect of that. It will just happen by default. But happening by default is what we have now, really. So there was a recent appeal that was approved in Alburn. Well done to Barton Wilmore and Christopher Young on that one, and the rest of the team. So that was in Sussex. It was in September. It's quite a small community, quite a rural location. And when we look at what the white paper is doing, which is going to divide up areas into growth areas where planning permission will essentially be automatic, very similar to an allocation that we have now. Some will argue that that's not the case, but it will be an allocation. And then we'll have renewal areas, which are likely to be where we have development limits now, you know, brownfield land, the line drawn around the town within a development limit. And then we'll have growth areas. So we will still be making planning applications in protected areas. We'll still be making planning applications in renewal areas. And I sympathise with the government, because we've got so many vested interests. The system has become so complicated, even though they tried 8 years ago to solve the system. But as advocates of specialist housing, there's many reports came out recently about the benefits of downsizing, right sizing, care, social care budgets, NHS budgets associated with extra care accommodation and other types. You know, it seems like a no-brainer. It should be an absolute priority for government to deliver this. And I know Jeremy and Housing, Lynn and ARCO and other organisations are trying to make it a priority. I mean, again, I don't want to be flippant, but I often think we should be, when I go to some areas and I see the increase in over 65s and the increase in over 85s and the projected increases and the increases that have happened in the last 10 years, you know, I am using the language, which is a bit over the top, but I think justified, which is that, you know, there's a demographic emergency in this area, and you should be making it a top 5 priority for your local plan and your development plan, and we just don't see that happening. So councils deal with specialist housing in a number of ways. One of the ways they do it is they don't do anything in their local plan. They don't do anything in their local plan. There's no specific policy about it. The second way they do it is they have a criteria-based policy, which will say, make sure your units are near the shops and make sure your units are here, and you can build within development limits. And some councils have actually got very positive policy. There was a recent report using a traffic light system saying this council's got an excellent policy. So Horsham, I'll take as an example, they have an excellent policy. Wiltshire have an excellent policy, which allows development to take place outside development limits in the open countryside. But coming back to that Alborn site, which was a great appeal success against a refusal, there is no way under this system of growth, renewal, and protected that site would ever have been allocated or be into one of those areas. Noting that though, you would still be free to make an application for that proposal. You would still be free to put in a planning application for that, as you will have to do on others. What's really happening here is a shift, a change in the power relationship between central government and local government. And central government are taking back power. They're going to impose binding figures on councils at lower levels, but that will just be a general figure. Some will argue we've already got binding figures, but the individual councils have more input at the present time into those figures. My greatest issue with planning now in specialist housing and planning for the future, and the third thing that happens, I should say, on councils is in local plans is they attempt to allocate sites. They try and allocate sites, which is not always easy. And I feel for the councils that it's very difficult. And of course, the operators and the developers of extra care, they've got a situation whereby they are trying to compete with house builders, compete with those wishing to develop land for employment. So in many occasions, many of the schemes that come forward are within that renewal area, they're within development limits. There are 40, 50, 60 extra care apartments, sometimes more. You know, many of the care villages are much larger now, 150, 200 units. And it's very difficult for them to compete with different types of landowner. But my biggest issue is an issue that this document doesn't address. I can't see the time. Doesn't address, and that really is that there's no disaggregation of the figures for housing for older people. So the system we have now is really asking councils to try and give numbers. The PPG, the Planning Practice Guidance, says they could give numbers for the different types of specialist housing, how many care home beds we need over the next 20 years, how many extra care units we need over the next 20 years. Many councils don't even meet that very fundamental thing. So you could run a sort of mini 5-year land supply on extra care, because they lump it all together as specialist housing and they don't disaggregate it down into individual figures. Again, all of us here are probably well aware of the benefits of extra care. In many ways, local plans are more important than national policy in many cases. And I can only say to you that the industry is very bad at engaging with local plans, but that's really going to have to change. I think what's going to happen now is in these in these automatic planning permission sites within within growth areas, these allocations, I think what's going to happen is developers, landowners are going to have even more of a beauty parade. It's really going to be a big fun fight. That system of local plan allocation, which is going to be shortened, is going to be, you are going to have to cram everything into your 1,000 houses or 500 hectare scheme to make it special and appeal to the community. I mean, that's happening already, of course, but you're going to have to make sure your affordable is top notch, your open space is top notch, your environment is top notch, your design, because one of these pillars is about design, your energy efficiency, because you're really trying to get the council to, and the local people now with their supposed enhanced role. So you're going to have to really fight hard to do everything you can to make your application appealing to the wider community. And that will all have to be done at the beginning. How practical it is another question, of course. You know, I'm very skeptical in many ways about, you know, how it's going to work in council's resources, which you will have heard elsewhere. But I think it might be seen as an opportunity. The first day it came out, the white paper and the standard methodology, particularly the white paper, I thought, well, that's no different from what we've got now. You know, it's exactly the same. You know, in the renewal areas where many developers like McCarthenstone, Adlington, and Churchill are trying to provide specialist housing, there's already a presumption in favour of development. In the growth areas, which are allocations, where we're now seeing that they will essentially be granted outline permission, those are already got a high presumption in favour if they're an allocation. So I know that's a very simplistic side to it and way to look at it, but I just think it's useful to think about. And then that dynamic about changes to the power dynamic. Local people are going to have a lot of say in those growth areas and in the renewal areas about design codes. They are going to be, to a certain extent, in the local development plan. And part of that can be the beauty of an area, healthy living, but also the ability of those developments to accommodate different age groups and different people in affordable housing and so on. But in many respects, as I said, we do have a system like that now. It's just the system we have now. So this is being voiced really as radical reform, you know, and Prime Minister Johnson was saying this is a radical reform. In many respects, it's not a radical reform. It's just, and some people have said to me that it's similar. It's going back to what we had in the 60s and 70s when we had these city development plans, areas that could be developed, areas that couldn't be developed. And I feel for the planning policy officers in the council, how they are going to do this very shortened local plan situation and how that's going to work. It's going to be a real bun fight. So I think people should be making comments. Doesn't even really ask a question about the mix of population and different areas of the population and meeting the needs of different groups. And maybe the most disappointing thing is in the report, of course, it does mention first homes. I'm not against first homes. I'm all for first homes, and that's for first-time buyers. But wouldn't it have been nice if we're covering first-time homes and that's an issue in the undersupply? Wouldn't it have been nice if they'd said some things about the last time buy? And would that not have been the right thing to do, given this incredible situation we have? You know, so what I'm saying in total is there's good that's going to come from this. I'm sure there's good that's going to come if we can ever get it in place. And however long it takes to get in place, there'll be bad that comes from it. But the industry really has to engage and try and get engaged to try and get the mix of the houses that we build, you know, how many houses we build is important, but also the type of houses is important. So again, I've just completely ignored the slides, so I do apologise, but I think it was useful for people to be able to read some of the most important parts. So there is a bit at the end. You've got to make comments by the 29th of October. You know, I'm helping various organisations make comments and say things, which will be very brief because it doesn't say very much about specialist housing. But you too need to raise it up the agenda. And it is a big agenda. There are people like Lord Best and others who are very interested in specialist housing. But if we don't get in at the foundations and say, remember us, I think we might just get swept away in the mix. So I'll leave it at that, Jeremy. Hopefully I haven't annoyed too many people. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, because I think, you know, the paper is a detailed complex, and I think you said very early on, you know, you need a PhD to read it. You've actually navigated it and give us a really good oversight of that, and also made some sort of observation about what I think you said was, you know, the issues around the mixed use and mixed age, and looking at issues around specialist housing is quite silent on this. But there may be ways that we can use it in relation to looking at land growth and renewal. So I'm hoping this will stimulate some of the debate. And I know that we've got a number of people with us who work for some of those organisations that you've referred to in your presentation. So on behalf of the Linford Now, let's just say a big thank you. And let's throw this open. I hope everybody's got a drink at hand. This is very informal, conversation and questions and a discussion. Lois, do we have any sort of questions that have come up in the chat box while we've been listening to Dan and John?
Hiya. I'm just having a little look now. I think Rose asked a question, but I believe that was answered in Dan's presentation. So I can't see any kind of other direct questions. So if anybody kind of wants to pick on any of the points that they've made in any of the comments, or Jeremy, if you've got any questions.
Well, why don't I kick off, Lois, and then John and Dan, if you're happy with that, then we'll carry on the conversation. And part of this is prompted by a dear friend of the Lynn, Patrick Devlin from the architect, who was one of the co-authors of the first HAPPI report. We just celebrated more or less 10 years of HAPPI, so it's quite useful. But and this is probably links both to Dan and a bit to John. Patrick talks about in the chat box about lifetime neighbourhoods, you know, and you know, the Healthy Homes Bill. There's an aspect, I think, when we were looking at it in relation to the HAPPI design principles, that virtually all the 12 principles that you set out were either directly or indirectly linked to HAPPI could be linked to it very easily. But I was just wondering whether you had thought about lifetime neighbourhoods and some of the work that Baroness Andrews has taken forward, perhaps another champion of this in the future for you.
Yeah, I think we looked at that. I mean, there are so many related campaigns for improved standards in various areas. That's one example. There's also the Home Coalition's work for higher standards relating to accessibility. There's just like so many, and they're all good, but they all kind of overlap in slightly complicated ways, and the landscape's difficult. One of the things we try to do with the Healthy Homes Bill is to create, I suppose the best way to frame it is to create a regulatory environment in which these various asks people have got, these various campaigns for higher standards on various fronts, including things like accessibility, are more achievable. So they're easy, the system enables that kind of change more effectively, rather than being one which is kind of fragmented and broken and doesn't necessarily push for the highest standards which are possible. Things like high standards and accessibility would be much more achievable if you had a system based around a series of core principles in that sense. So I don't think we've looked in detail into what you're asking about particularly, but so many of these different campaigns for high standards would hopefully find their work easier and achieve what their objectives are within our structure.
And you mentioned the Home Coalition. For those of you who don't know about it, it's the Housing Made for Everyone Coalition, which is a joint programme led by the Centre for Ageing Better and Habenteg, and both the TCPA and Lynn are members of it. And one of the things it is looking at the moment is around the consultation, not on planning, but on accessibility and accessible housing design as well. So again, looking at the Part M of the building regulations, and particularly around what sort of minimum and maximum sort of standards should be around that. So thanks very much for sort of referring to home. Patrick, did you have a secondary question or anything?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I was just typing away in the box. Maybe I won't send that.
Well, unless you're doing an email to somebody else.
No, it was directed to all of you. It's just become so sharply focused through COVID that isolation is a disaster at the time when, for health reasons, people are being more isolated, So we are talking a lot in the office and with other people about 15-minute city, the 20-minute neighborhood, the need to integrate the things you need from day to day with the needs of the people around you and come together. So that's one point. There should be a fair win behind this. And I think, John, it's ignored more or less, that whole issue of substance in the white paper. I haven't quite got through all of it yet. Enjoying the references to beauty, but no, who knows what that means. The other aspect that is crucially pointed up by all of this is the aspiration to engage people in the planning process very quickly without any thought really to educating people to the level where they have the tools to take part. Some of the most active participants of those of us who are constantly engaged in the planning process know, and I'm off to a committee shortly, a virtual committee, are people over the age of 55, over the age of 60, who have A, the time, B, the education to engage positively with the process. That is something that needs to be broadened to be multi-generational, so that everybody's talking in the same space. And again, I love the aspiration of the white paper. That I can see zero in the bits I've got through so far, zero information about how that's going to be achieved, and it's a huge leap to make.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think that sort of engagement that you referred to, we may come back to our colleagues in Newcastle about some of the things, the Elders Forum and the work they've done there. I know we've got a couple of people on there, so if there's anything you'd like to share with us, please do. This issue that also came up from John's presentation, which is around looking at design codes and linking into development plans. And John, you talked about, what is beauty. You also talked about healthy living. Do you see things like that moving forward, that there will be at a local level, like we've got supplementary planning guidance, there may be a design code for HAPPI or an age-friendly design code being developed? Perhaps some of the work that others are doing in Manchester and the like might be around their spatial planning policy might come to the fore.
Oh, I think so. I mean, I've had design officers at the council quoting to me the HAPPI guidelines and saying, your designers have made a right hash of this. You need to go away and look at the HAPPI report. So I'm sure the HAPPI report will be that. And part of it is, of course, planning for beautiful and sustainable places, which does to some extent bring in health, not as much as I would like it to, or I'm sure others would like to. So again, I think the worry is, I'm always a little bit worried about design codes, because we'll have these, some of these growth areas, there'll be 500 hectares plus, some of them will be new settlements, and design codes can work quite well, but there's also an argument that it stifles innovation and it causes issues with that, and and if too many cooks spoiling the broth, I think that's a saying as well, can that happen? Are you limiting the individual designer? I'm very interested in self-build, people wanting to be individuals and design what they want to do. So, but I think one of the big fears about design codes in the growth areas and these automatic planning permissions is that we are going to get that if the public miss the boat at the beginning, just as was said by Keith, if they miss the boat at the beginning, the design and how these houses look is all done and dusted. When they suddenly realize in 6 months' time, somebody's building 500 houses over there and they don't have to do anything else, they're going to build them. That worries me, that's going to happen.
Thanks for that. I think we do have a question from Janet. I don't know, Janet, if you want to ask it specifically. It's a very interesting one about your local U3A. So can we unmute Janet? I also want to ask Gareth something from ARCO, because I know that one of the things they've done is that they've looked at this and have got both a report that they published earlier this year with Professor Les Maythew, but also they've recently announced an advisory panel, and I think one of the core objectives is around planning. So Gareth, just to forewarn you that if I may pick on you, I'd welcome some thoughts from you, and perhaps also whether we need to have a particular use class order may be an issue as well. So
no problem, Jeremy. Happy to come in whenever you need me.
Thank you, mate. So, Janet, are you live?
No, I've unmuted you, Janet. You should be able to. Janet, you are unmuted if you'd like to ask a question.
Sorry, I'm just working from my iPad. Do you want me to talk now?
Please do.
Yes, please ask your
Sorry,
question.
I'd lost all sound for a moment. I'm sorry, I'm on my iPad, and for some reason I can't get my image on, so you'll just get my voice. No, I was just asking, because it's clear in the white paper, it does seem that, you know, apart from consultation at the really early stage on the design codes, the ability to really effectively engage communities is very much diminished. And my particular interest, because I started with my local university, they used to be called University of Third Age, now U3A. There's 450,000 members in England. So potentially that's quite an effective voice if we can get them engaged in thinking about their future housing needs. And I did a monthly talk in my local area. There were about 100 people on the Zoom poll. And it was really interesting because of them, over 40% thought they would need to move in the future. 12% were interested in retirement or sheltered housing. 28% were interested in co-housing.
Oh, Janet, I'm afraid we've lost you. John, the question's actually in the chat box. Have you had a chance to look at that? Because you may be able to comment from that.
I can come back on some of the questions in the
Yeah,
chat.
please.
Yeah, please do. Start off then.
Yeah, well, I was going to say a couple of things. The first is, this is one of the areas of the white paper which makes the TCPA extremely sceptical, which is that the talks right up front about increasing engagement in the planning system. And then the only concrete actually solutions it presents, apart from talking in a very abstract way about technology, actually take away the right for individuals to be heard in person. And that's the one right embedded by law they have in that stage of the process. So incredibly frustrating. I think engagement, the government has missed a clear opportunity, either on purpose or accidentally. I'm not sure, probably a mixture of both, to involve people both at the stage now and making decisions about what's in the white paper. And that could be through, for example, a citizens' assembly. They're well established by now in research as a way of dealing what seem to be intractable policy issues. So this is where you get a roughly representative panel of the public, randomly selected, but kind of representative of the population if possible. You present through experts to them information about the genuine basis on which you're making decisions. What are your policy objectives? What are the real constraints in terms of resourcing and land and that kind of thing? Yeah, and then from there, you leave it to the public to make a decision. And in generally, they make much more progressive decisions than existing decision-making frameworks produce. It's been used very effectively on the problem of climate change and how you address climate change. And it's been used for major infrastructure projects all around the world as well. It's a quite impressive result. So that's the first thing that at this stage that should be used. And then later on, I mean, as an organisation, we've signed up to something called the Charter for Democracy in Planning. Is the idea, which is really, I think, again, there's a lot of evidence that what makes people oppose new developments, whether they're new train lines or new housing, is very often actually the feeling that they wouldn't have had a say anyway. So they just turn up and say, we don't agree with this because they don't feel like they shaped that decision at all. There was a lot of experiment with that line of thinking in the early 2010s with the coalition government. But again, you couldn't really have a genuine say on these decisions, and the powers of neighbourhood planning were limited. So I think we need more ambition on that front, I think. I think there's a way in which you can make sure that mindless NIMBYism, and I'm not entirely sure it exists in the way that is so often talked about, doesn't take precedence over a genuine need, and you can actually create strategic decisions. But at the same time, you can use things like citizens' assemblies more effectively, and they've not been used. I think there's a genuine belief in government at the moment that well, a genuine mistrust of local councils and genuinely local decision-making ability. And the idea you can give it, I think a lot of the concerns about the algorithm have been kind of overblown in many ways, but what that is symptomatic of handing over decisions to an objective system, which can then just assign housing locally without trusting people that they can actually make decisions themselves, which I don't think is true. And actually increases antagonism. But anyway, that's largely my point of view.
What I'm interested in there is some of the thing you're saying about the democratic process of engagement and participation. So this is not just in terms of planning. I think it's around all the civic sort of relationships we're going. And then at the moment around COVID is starting to real sort of on the one hand fracture, but also the other way. I mean, Patrick in one of his earlier questions was saying, you know, how this is compounded by loneliness and isolation and you know, those sort of communities not connecting as much as they used to. So John, over to you. Sorry, you were going to say something, and then I'm going to pass over to Gareth just to give some thoughts from an ARCO perspective. John?
Yeah, my internet connection is unstable, it keeps telling me. But anyway, can you still hear me?
Carry on from here.
Got you back. The only thing I wanted to say was, in terms of Janet's question, was of course is a power grab by central government. Some people wouldn't agree, but it's a power grab, and I don't understand how you can take decisions away from local councillors and say that that's going to make it more democratic. But that's just my view. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting point. And I might invite somebody who I know is a former local councillor. I can't remember if she still is, but Emma, you might want to have a word on this in a minute. But Gareth, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So just going back to the point about the specific use class and category for extra, John was saying earlier on, it's some really good points about this. I think there's some challenges and opportunities presented by the where the white paper is going with this. Because currently only about 10% of local plans do include specific planning policies for older people, despite the fact that the ministerial guidance encourages this. But it's one of those things which is a should rather than a must. And so I think it has taken on advisement. But even within that 10%, only a minority of them actually draw distinctions between the different types of older people's housing that's out there. And our members provides the extra care and retirement villages option, which John referred to. So we think there's clearly some problems with the current system when it comes to encouraging what is a very underprovided for form of older people's housing. And so it does mean that with so much more of the policy determination being centralised, the ministerial guidance and central national planning policy will become much more important. And that's why, as you said, Jeremy, we are advocating a specific use class for retirement communities with what we think should be a quite tightly defined set of criteria, including the availability of services and care on site. I think this is particularly important because it does demonstrate that these developments would be contributing to local infrastructure and helping to reduce some of the strain on the local social care and health systems, rather than just being an additional debit on that side. And obviously that this means that if there is going to be a specific use class which does need to be identified, the government needs to take a far more cohesive view in how it treats extra care and retirement communities, which has been lacking. One of the things people will have heard from ARCO many times in the past is that the government itself has 11 different terms it used to describe our sector. At 4 of them, it's 4 or 5 within MHCLG itself. So there just needs to be far greater clarity in the government's thinking and approach. So one of the other things that we are calling for is a task force to work across government to try and encourage the growth of this kind of provision. The only other thing to add here is that the kind of distinctions that we're talking about, it would be very useful, I think, not just for the government, but for residents and prospective residents to have these kind of distinctions between retirement communities and extra care on one side, traditional retirement housing, sheltered housing drawn in planning policy. I think that would help to clarify some of the confusion that's out there and help to drive the increase in supply which the sector desperately needs.
Thanks for that, and thanks very much for sort of giving your overview. And we support the need for greater clarity around the use class orders, as well as to provide both consumer confidence and awareness, but also market confidence awareness of the growth potential for this as well. And whether it's a social housing operator or indeed a private developer or commercial landlord in this who's interested in re-providing or developing new. So again, it's really critical that we have this in place, and some of that relies on having a really good understanding at a local level. And I'm just thinking about that democratic bit that we talked about and that Dan raised. Emma, would you be willing to share some of your insights as somebody who's worked very closely in that area?
Yes, of course. I retired as a local councillor last May, so after 16 years of service on my local authority, and also a member of the planning committee. And I think one of the points that I would make, having reviewed the white paper, obviously from a former member perspective, but also someone who works in the development industry as well, is actually the importance of so many things really came to the fore in this. Because if you talk about improving democracy and improving accountability, you have to look back to the people that are making the decisions. And I know that I've shared with a number of you my frustrations having sat on a planning committee when people didn't understand their local plan that they should have read and fully understood before making decisions. And then that got further down to not wanting to be a net importer of older people without realizing that actually those old people currently live within their communities. They're perhaps just living in homes that are not fit for their requirements anymore. And I think that's been one of the really interesting areas that I've discovered from my time when I was an elected member before I worked in the retirement sector, and then obviously learned more about from that side of things. I think one of the areas that's particularly important if we look at the need for our aging population, and there's a statistic I know I've heard you say before, Jeremy, and others, in terms of by 2050, 50% of the population will be over the age of 50. That's a huge number, and it's not too far away. And it's really important that actually we look at all types of housing for older people, which best meets their needs and their needs and the choices that they want to make at each age of their journey. And I think the clarification and the understanding about what each kind of part of that journey is about will become particularly important. But I also think it's really important that as a sector, we don't try and knock one group in favour of another. Actually, there's more than enough space, more than enough demand for everything that's being offered in the market currently.
Thanks for letting me put you on the spot there. So that's very, very helpful as well. We're going to be wrapping up in a minute, so please grab your last drinks, last hour before the bell tolls. I'm not sure under COVID policy whether we will have to be out by 5 to 10, but obviously it's coming up to just after 5 o'clock. And let's come back to Dan and John before we sort of wrap up. And Dan, in your presentation, you mentioned some of the work that you might want to do in Wales. And John, I wanted to know whether what you've described around the planning white paper only applies to England, or does it apply to other nation states? But the reason why I ask is because some of the work the Housing Lyn and our Housing Lyn Welsh members are really interested in is something that they have. They have two pieces of legislation. One is the Future Generations Act. So it's not just looking at the here and now, it's also thinking what the implications of planning, development, design will be longer term. And the other thing is their social services legislation is based around the principle of well-being. So again, that I think sort of fits in quite neatly with thinking about the health and well-being and how planning can be much more sort of moulded into that. And again, I know that TCPA have got a quite useful toolkit around planning for health as well. So Dan, any thoughts about that Welsh interface?
Yeah, we thought it'd be interesting to do this work in Wales exactly for the reasons you just described. They have a different set of challenges and a different set of weaknesses in how they think about these things. So the regulatory framework and things like you mentioned, like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, means that at the national level, their policy framework is much more advanced in thinking about this kind of principle-based approach, which tries to guarantee minimum standards and shape decision-making in a coordinated manner. The challenges they've got are more on the delivery level. So we thought by working in the context of Wales and with the Welsh government, they'd be more amenable to thinking about this way of thinking, partly because they've just done more thinking like this already. They've got things like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And then we could use that as a kind of momentum to try and develop how this would work at the local level, how it would improve implementation. And in a sense, like I kind of mentioned before, that would then help us to put pressure back onto the Westminster government and say, clearly the Welsh government gets it, this is a different starting point, but they're also more advanced in the way you think about this. Their regulatory framework already has elements which we'd lobby for through something like a Healthy Homes Bill. Yeah, so that was our starting point. Yeah, and Wales, the missing bit of the national kind of legislative patchwork is the one which makes sure that local plan policy then follows through on things like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is where something like a Healthy Homes Bill might benefit.
Thanks. And John, any thoughts about the sort of like where this applies in terms of the white paper?
England, only applies in England.
Okay, thanks. And are there any other comments that you want to pick up from the conversations we've had before I sort of sum up?
I'm just saying, you know, at the minute in local plans, the local population, local people, they've basically got 2 3-week periods to make their views known, which they send in, the parish council send in. Sometimes they've got a 9-week, 3 sets of 3 periods. You know, I don't see that changing. I don't see it becoming accountable. But what they will be losing is they'll be losing the ability to complain and make comments, constructive comments, of course, as well, about these growth areas. You know, it will all be done at the beginning, and everyone has to get in at the beginning locally. And to me, it looks less democratic than the system we have now. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And on behalf of everybody who's with us this afternoon, thank you both for your stimulating presentations. I know a number of people have asked for copies of the slides. I know that yours are already on the Housing Link website. And let's just kindly put up a page which shows where the TCPA Healthy Homes Act legislation is, and the link to that down. And I think that's right there. He's been saying he wrote a very helpful blog for us earlier this year on some things when the planning paper came out. And you can also see a page we have on our website, which looks at where where every local authority currently has a local development plan out for consultation. So again, that's something that we work closely with Tetlow King to update regularly. So if you're interested in this, please do both go to the TCPA website and or the Housing Link planning portal. We look forward to inviting you to future happy hours. We're having a short break next week. There isn't one next week, but we come back on the 29th of October, and it picks up on some of the healthy issues that Dan highlighted, actually. We've been looking at this specifically in relation to how can we look at ways to prevent either a hospital admission or to support an early discharge back for those people who have either experienced a long-term condition or indeed an illness or injury, both COVID and non-COVID. And we're putting the spotlight on a number of different localities and health economies who work closely with local government and housing partners to both deliver healthy homes hubs in localities. So again, that may be something that, Dan, you may be interested in. There's actually in Derby a healthy homes hub that coordinates a lot of this. And also with Oxford City Council, the way that they fast-track disabled facilities grants to enable people to return home early and avoid a lengthy hospital stay. And we'll be also looking at some of the issues with the College of Occupational Therapy and some of the technology advances through digital that Tunstall and others have been taking forward as well. So I do hope you can join us again on the 29th of October, and we conclude our sort of autumn series on the 3rd of November with a special feature on isolation and loneliness. Again, some of the things that Patrick highlighted in his observations, and that's looking at that through the lens of what's happening in Wales, both in terms of social isolation, but also the exclusion that people experience through digital, through the built environment and through their housing. So please do sign up to our upcoming Housing Lens. I'm really delighted that we could focus on planning today. Thanks ever so on behalf of everybody, John and Dan. And I wish everybody well and good luck in the areas that you live in. We look forward to taking this forward digitally. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.